The neighbors said they heard a scream before they saw the flashing lights, but nobody knew it came from the man the cops thought was a stranger, even though he was standing on the porch he'd bought with his own hard-earned money, gripping the keys that proved he belonged there. It was the kind of night where the air felt heavy, where tension crawled through the darkness long before trouble arrived, and where fate seemed to be waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth the officers never imagined they were walking into. Malik Turner had spent 20 years serving his country without ever asking for applause. He'd been the quiet one in the room, the man who blended into shadows, watched patterns, read danger long before it appeared. He'd spent years undercover, tracking men who hid in plain sight, breaking open cases that others didn't even know existed. Every file with his signature held secrets the public would never hear. He wasn't the type to brag about being FBI. He wasn't the type to flash a badge just to feel important. He had seen too much darkness to ever crave attention. All he wanted tonight was to come home, step through the front door of the house he had finally finished renovating, and breathe in the peace he had worked his whole life to earn. A simple evening, a quiet porch, a single moment of calm after months of non-stop missions. But calm never lasts long in a world where quick assumptions hold more power than truth. The moment Malik stepped out of his truck and walked toward his porch, he felt the shift in the air. He saw blinds twitch. He saw a neighbor's porch light flicker on. He didn't think much of it at first. People get curious when someone moves into a neighborhood they're not used to. He'd dealt with worse. He could handle a few uneasy stares. What he didn't expect was the sound of tires screeching before he even reached his front steps. He didn't expect 2 patrol cars to roll up fast enough to rattle the ground beneath his feet. He didn't expect 3 officers to jump out like they had been waiting for him all along, already convinced he didn't belong, already rehearsing the version of the story they'd tell later. In that instant, Malik felt something cold inside him. Not fear, not anger, just disappointment. The same disappointment he'd felt countless times in the field when judgment replaced logic, when assumptions replaced facts, when bias created danger out of thin air. But he stayed still. He kept his hands visible. He breathed slow and deep the way he had trained himself to during high-risk operations. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He knew how these moments could spiral. He had watched men lose everything because someone else panicked before thinking. He had watched lives change with one wrong twitch of a finger. So he stood there, silent, steady, harmless in appearance even though his heart was pounding harder than he let on. Inside his jacket was his badge, the same badge that had saved dozens of victims, taken down criminals nobody knew were walking free, and earned him respect in rooms where danger lived. But tonight that badge felt far away. Tonight these officers didn't see a federal agent. They didn't see a homeowner. They didn't see a man who had served the country longer than most of them had been adults. They just saw him as a threat. He heard their accusations like echoes pounding the inside of his skull: trespassing, suspicious activity, potential break-in. All for standing on his own porch with his own keys in his own hand. It was almost darkly ironic. He'd spent his whole career catching people who didn't belong in the places they broke into. Now he was being treated like one. As the officers circled him, the neighborhood watched from windows lit up like little glowing judgmental eyes. Phones were recording, whispers were spreading, stories were forming. In the eyes of the watching crowd, the truth didn't matter yet. They were observing a moment that looked dramatic, messy, and easy to misunderstand. But Malik's silence wasn't fear, it was calculation. It was the experience of a man who had dealt with hundreds of hostile confrontations and lived to tell the tale. He studied each officer the way he would study a suspect: posture, tone, intentions, training level. He saw nervousness in one, aggression in another, uncertainty in the last. He knew which ones were likely to escalate and which ones needed someone to guide them back down. He thought about revealing his identity immediately, but something inside him hesitated. Not out of pride, not out of revenge, but out of weariness, a deep, bone-tired weariness that made him wonder how fast people judged, how quickly they drew lines between who belonged and who didn't, how often his badge acted as a shield against problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Tonight, he wanted to see how far this would go. Not to shame anyone, not to punish them, but to understand the depth of assumptions still poisoning the world he risked his life to protect. He watched the officers grow more frustrated as he didn't match the story they had already decided on. He wasn't running. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't resisting. He was calm. Too calm. And that confused them. It made them uneasy. People who panic are predictable. People who stay composed make others suspicious. Minutes passed like slow dripping water, each second tightening the tension in the air. Malik's neighbors continued recording, their curiosity slowly shifting into confusion as the man they thought was suspicious remained still, steady, unbothered. Something was off. Something wasn't adding up. One officer finally tried to push forward with cuffs in hand. That was when Malik knew the situation had hit its breaking point. He had waited long enough. He had given them every chance to think, to assess, to question themselves before acting. They hadn't. They were moments away from making a mistake that would change all of their careers forever. So when he finally reached inside his jacket, the officers panicked. Hands flew to holsters. Shouts tore through the night. Malik froze for a split second, not because he feared for his life, but because he knew that one more misunderstanding could destroy everything. He raised his hand slowly, deliberately, clearly, and the badge glinted in the porch light. Not a fake badge, not a flimsy ID. The unmistakable shield of a federal agent. The air changed instantly. The shouting stopped. The officers' faces drained of color like someone had pulled the ground out from under them. One officer took a step back. Another lowered his gaze in disbelief. The youngest one looked like he wanted to disappear completely. The silence that followed was heavier than the accusations that came before. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The neighborhood watched with their jaws practically on the floor, recording every second as realization spread across the scene like a hard slap of reality. Malik didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He didn't lash out. That wasn't who he was. His entire career had been built on staying objective, staying steady, staying rational in moments far more dangerous than this one. But inside him, a deep ache formed, an ache heavier than anger, heavier than frustration, heavier than exhaustion. It was the ache of a man who had spent his life protecting a system that still couldn't see him as human unless he proved it with a badge. The officers scrambled to explain themselves, stumbling over apologies and excuses, but Malik barely listened. He wasn't interested in hearing why they assumed the worst about him. He wasn't interested in how they justified their mistake. He knew their words before they said them. He'd heard them in countless reports, countless cases, countless incidents just like this one. He simply unlocked his door, stepped inside, and left them standing on the porch with more regret than they had ever felt in their careers. But the night didn't end there. The videos from the neighbors traveled fast, the kind of fast that doesn't stop once it starts. People shared it not because of the confrontation, but because of the twist they never expected. Comments poured in. Debates ignited. The truth spread wider than the assumptions ever had. Within days, the footage reached federal desks, police supervisors, newsrooms, and training academies. It became a lesson no classroom could ever teach. A reminder that power doesn't excuse assumptions, that judgment can be a weapon, and that respect shouldn't depend on a badge. For the officers involved, nothing remained the same. They were required to undergo retraining, counseling, evaluation, and an internal review that forced them to confront their own biases. The department issued a public statement. The chief held a press conference acknowledging the mistake. Policies were rewritten. Protocols were updated. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, one they needed more than they realized. As for Malik, he didn't seek revenge. He didn't file lawsuits or call for punishment. He didn't need to. The weight of their own actions was heavier than anything he could have imposed. Instead, he kept living quietly, the same way he always had. He mowed his lawn. He fixed the fence. He sat on his porch some evenings and watched kids ride bikes down the street. But now, the neighbors waved when they saw him. Some stopped to apologize. Some brought gifts. Some admitted they had jumped to conclusions because they didn't know him. Malik accepted their words with grace, not because he needed their approval, but because healing only works when people are willing to face their mistakes. In time, the neighborhood changed. People grew more aware, more cautious about judging, more willing to pause before assuming. Malik became a symbol of quiet strength, not because he wanted to be, but because his story held a mirror to everyone who watched it unfold. And every once in a while, when he looked out at the street he now called home, he felt a strange sense of peace. Not because life was suddenly fair. Not because the world had transformed overnight. But because he had seen something rare: accountability, awareness, and growth born from a moment that could have ended far differently. In the end, the karmic justice wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simple, clear, powerful in the softest way. The truth came out, the lesson settled deep, and the world around him shifted, even if just a little. And sometimes, that small shift is the beginning of something much bigger.